Welcome to the fourth and final lecture in the course, Henry George, Karl Marx and Their Followers, a Century of Sometimes Intense Rivalry. In 1938, a young attorney named Jacob Schwartzman began his studies in political economy at the Henry George School of Social Science in New York City. Jack to his friends and his family, had escaped from state socialism that consumed his homeland, the Ukraine. He wholeheartedly embraced the principles of individualism and brought this perspective to the Henry George community. After completing the school's program, Jack joined the all-volunteer faculty, becoming one of the movement's most prolific writers and effective teachers. That same year, 1940, he began writing a series of articles taking on some of those who had, unfairly in Jack's view, criticized Henry George. In the March-April 1942 issue of Land and Freedom, he took on the socialist critics. First on his list was the Reverend F.M. Sprague, author of Socialism and Genesis to Revelation, published in 1893. He then examined what Norman Thomas wrote in his 1934 book, The Choice Before Us. Jack essentially pointed to the misrepresentations of what Henry George actually wrote and what Georgists, as they were now being referred to generally, believe and embrace as essential to political economy as a method of scientific investigation. He also offered facts to counter socialist claims. For example, nor is it true that there is no available land that can be had for nothing. According to League of Nations statistics, the world is very thinly populated at a density of only 38.4 persons per square mile. While the best lands have been appropriated through private ownership, there are vast stretches of unused and unclaimed soil on this earth, and water, being part of land in the economic sense, constitutes in many parts of the world a margin of production. The phrase margin of production he used referred to that part of nature the use of which yields no rent. All that could be produced rightfully belonged to its producer as wages, with or without the use of capital goods. He continues, capital does not exploit labor, since it cannot fix labor's wages. The latter is determined by the margin. The fact that capitalists and laborers fight one another does not any more prove natural antagonism than does the fact that laborers fight amongst themselves prove that labor exploits labor. Blind and fruitless hatreds are the natural results of a sick and poverty-stricken world. On the European continent, Henry George's analysis found only scattered and inconsistent advocacy. One German professor of economics and sociology, Franz Oppenheimer, arrived in the United States in 1938, and just a few years later was one of the co-founders of the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, a journal that from its inception encouraged scholarly analysis of Henry George's political economy. An article by Oppenheimer titled Scientific Communism Disproved appeared in the June 1943 issue of another publication, The Freeman. Utopian socialism rested on the assumption that society is a mechanism, a badly constructed contraption which must be repaired or replaced by an entirely new kind of machine. Marx knew this to be wrong. He had imbibed Hegel's conception of society as an organism, grown and developed according to natural law in the dialectics of evolution, but not shaped by dictum of a political wizard. The new society could not be constructed. It could come into being only through organic development out of the capitalist order. Socialists could alleviate and accelerate the birth of the new order. They could not build it like a machine. Communism is a danger because it paralyzes the defenders and strengthens and heartens the enemies of peace and freedom. It cleaves the nations into fighting groups, disturbs economy by useless quarrels and senseless feuds, and disturbs unity at a time when the highest solidarity alone can safeguard us. In an article printed by the New York Times on 3 September 1943, the paper described Henry George as an American socialist. Otto Dorn, president of the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, contacted the newspaper to correct this misrepresentation. Dorn wrote, "Henry George was never a socialist. He believed in individual initiative and enterprise, rather than a socialized state, which is a planned economy governed from the top." Proving this point, beginning in 1949, the Henry George School in Chicago established a commerce and industry division under the direction of John Lawrence Monroe. Monroe later branched out, establishing the Institute for Economic Inquiry to teach the virtues of free enterprise. As the defeat of Germany and Japan neared, the Georgia School of Economic Science in Ontario, Canada, published and distributed a pamphlet titled "After the War What? Work or Want?" The authors asked a few very fundamental questions of their fellow citizens. For our workers to have full employment under just conditions, it is not necessary that we adopt any socialistic schemes for state control of industry. We have freed the Negroes from chattel slavery, only to find we have still to free Negroes and whites from the industrial slavery consequent on the abuses of taxation and land tenure. It is these abuses which are making men despair of the future of democracy and advocate compulsory state control of all industry. They are seeking to cure the ills resulting from a wrong system of taxation and from state interference by intensifying the very things which cause them. The surrender of Germany and then Japan brought an end to the Second World War, but did not bring about peaceful relations between nations. Joseph Stalin orchestrated the westward expansion of Soviet-style state socialism. The Chinese fought a bloody civil war to achieve some sort of unification, the victors bringing in their own brand of state socialism. The list of uprisings, rebellions, and civil wars from the late 1940s on is too long to recount here. In those countries with relatively stable systems of government, with relatively honest and free elections, and with a commitment to honor the principle of majority rule, the debates now centered on the extent to which government would operate public utilities and otherwise direct economic activity. The masses had endured the deprivations of the Great Depression and were calling on those who governed to institutionalize prosperity. Thus, something of a stir was created when in 1953, the director of the Agricultural Economics Institute at Oxford University, Colin Clark, called instead for the taxation of land values. In a 10 September article printed in the Financial Times, Clark challenged conventional agricultural policies, then extended his argument to the entirety of economic production. If we were serious about wanting increased output from British agriculture, instead of playing politics with it, as both parties prefer to do, we should allow the farmer to sell his produce at free world market import prices. Rents also would be allowed to rise to an economic level. The absurdly low rents now charged for many farms do not encourage the farmer to make the fullest use of his land. We would also adopt a land tax, which falls not upon the buildings and improvements, but upon the economic value of the land itself. It is commonplace of economic theory that this form of taxation, and indeed this alone, is no deterrent to production, and indeed encourages farmers and landowners to make full use of their land, to subdivide it where possible, and employ more labor. A few years later, a Canadian geologist named Ernest J. Farmer commented on the rising number of students graduating from Canadian universities with degrees in economics, who concluded that solving Canada's economic and social problems called for the adoption of modified socialism. As for what was being taught by university economics professors, Farmer concluded, In one respect, many university economists have out-Marxed Marx. A large number of economic professors, somewhat distorting the teachings of J.M. Keynes, have argued that the only way to forfend, that is, avert, widespread unemployment is through the continual debasement of the money supply. While this argument is fallacious, patently so to anyone who understands economic fundamentals, it has strongly influenced governmental policies, the more so as it is pleasanter and easier for politicians to spend money than to raise it. The U.S. proponents of Henry George's solutions to generational poverty and economic instability found diminishing support within the federal and state legislative chambers as the 20th century advanced. The Commonwealth Land Party's final campaign had occurred back in 1928 with disappointing results. Few candidates for public office called for the changes incorporated in the platform of the Commonwealth Land Party. Throughout the first 3 decades of the 20th century, a few hundred single-tax enthusiasts met annually to give encouragement to one another and to report on any signs of progress that had occurred during the year. This photograph is from a 1914 conference organized under the auspices of the Joseph Fels Fund Commission. These conferences were suspended during the Second World War, renewed in 1949. During the Second World War, the Henry George School of Social Science continued to offer courses on political economy based on the works of Henry George. Extensions and affiliate programs opened in many cities around the country. The school opened a new headquarters in New York City to accommodate increased enrollment. In her regular report on school matters, Director Margaret Bateman informed supporters, "This spring has brought new encouragement, the highest enrollment in the New York school since pre-war days. This indicates a growing desire to study world problems. On Wednesday, April 10th, the school was operating almost at capacity. One class was so large that it was transferred to the auditorium and will be divided into 3 classes to facilitate intimate discussion." Across the Atlantic Ocean, the nations occupying the European continent were now engaged in a new social, economic, and political experiment. Citizens not subject to political domination by the Soviet Union demanded change, demanded what is best described as functional social democracy. In at least one European nation, Denmark, social democracy had a long history of advocacy from a sizable contingent of political and civic leaders sympathetic to the ideas of Henry George. From the early 20th century on, the Danish Social Democratic Party endorsed a collection of land values for public purposes. In the 1920s, the Danish Justice Party formed with the taxation of land values central to its platform. At the 1952 International Conference on Land Value Taxation and Free Trade, held in Odense, Denmark, the Danish geologist Dan Borner reported on the situation in Denmark, a report that reveals much about what was going on elsewhere as well. In recent years, there has been no legislation on the lines of our ideas. Indeed, on the question of free trade, it has gone directly against us. But there is the old saying that it is always darkest before dawn. Today, land value taxation and free trade are in daily debate all over the country. Following the Second World War, Denmark's citizens adopted a new constitution, creating a single-chamber government. In the election of September 1953, the Justice Party lost 3 of 9 seats it held. By 1960, the party lost all of its seats in Parliament, subsequently regained them, but finally lost their final 5 seats in 1982. Socialists had won 85 of 90 seats. From the time of Henry George's European travels, small groups of his converts were at work in France and Belgium. The translations of Henry George's books igniting renewed interest in the physiocratic writings of François Quesnay, A.R. Jacques Turgot, and Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours. the originators of the theoretical arguments in support of the public collection of the rent of land. A land reform league had been organized in Paris in 1927 with M. Sam Mayer as its head. The movement lost momentum because Mayer died in 1945 while imprisoned by the Germans in Auschwitz. At the 1949 International Conference to promote land value taxation and free trade held in England, two Europeans, Adad Bancel and Marcel Courdvrend, reported on the situation in France and Belgium. They offered several revealing observations regarding the strategies of the communists and socialists. The communists in France are principally occupied with sabotaging the Marshall Plan and destroying the public economy in order to create discontent and thus gain the chance to capture political power and rule the country on Russian lines. Most of the socialists are in agreement with them in the matter of nationalizing large private undertakings, to the undoing of public finance and the workers whom they mistakenly believe they are benefiting. The Belgians cannot be blamed in quite the same way. After investigating results in France, they have abandoned the idea of nationalizing the coal mines. The socialists in their National Congress of 1925 actually voted by a show of hands for a tax of 1% on the unimproved value of land, but this was merely paying lip service to Georgist ideas. A Greek named Pavlos Gianelia, who served in the Greek diplomatic service in Vienna until 1939, when he left Austria for Switzerland, was also a longtime proponent of Henry George's political economy. He became a regular contributing writer to the publication Land and Freedom. Pavlos wrote in early 1942 that he had had productive discussions with the Greek Prime Minister, who expressed real interest in bringing about Georgist reforms to Greece. Henry George's doctrines also found support in Spain, reportedly after Progress and Poverty was first translated from English into French, then from the French into Spanish. Public interest increased after the 1913 International Conference was held in Ronda, Spain. In the years prior to the Spanish Civil War, an attorney and professor of economics named Antonio F. Matthew Alonso was using Henry George's works as texts for his University of Salamanca courses. When the fascists gained power, he was falsely accused of treason and arrested. Although cleared of the charges, investigation into his teaching of Henry George's doctrines were challenged as anti-patriotic and anarchistic. Initially sentenced to death, this sentence was eventually reduced to a sentence of 6 years. He was prevented from returning to the university, and all of his possessions were confiscated. I've not been able to learn what happened to him in the ensuing years. However, a report delivered by Jordi Favalier at the 1949 International Conference described the overall situation as dark. Our numbers are reduced to 1/10 of what they were, and only a handful of self-denying, distinguished, and brave fighters for our ideals stand firm, defending themselves as best they can and attacking the wicked world around them with what little strength they have, without hope, but with noble unselfishness, the fruit of their faith in things true. During the Second World War, the president of the Chinese National Academy, Dr. Lai Yu-ling, visited the United States and on several occasions met with the director and trustees of the Henry George School of Social Science. During his 1942 visit, Director Margaret Bateman proposed that a Henry George School be established in China after the war. As events unfolded, this opportunity was lost to civil war and abandonment of mainland China to the communists. As Albert Einstein's status climbed as one of history's great intellectuals, an American proponent of Henry George's principles wrote to Einstein in 1931. Einstein replied that he had read the largest part of Progress and Poverty, but was unconvinced that George's remedy would solve the problems George had identified. Einstein some years earlier concluded that a socialist society offered the best opportunity for greater justice. Then in 1934, Einstein exchanged letters with Anna George DeMille, Henry George's daughter. He confirmed that he had read Progress and Poverty. As for Henry George's value to humanity, Einstein said, "Men like Henry George are rare, unfortunately. One cannot imagine a more beautiful combination of intellectual keenness, artistic form, and fervent love of justice. Every line is written as if for our generation. The spreading of these works is a really deserving cause, for our generation especially has many and important things to learn from Henry George." In 1918, Albert Einstein had argued the case for a socialist economy, a view he explained again in 1949. The individual is able to think, feel, strive, and work by himself, but he depends so much upon society. His life is made possible through the labor and the accomplishments of the many millions, past and present, who are all hidden behind the small word society. The economic anarchy of capitalist society as it exists today is, in my opinion, the real source of the evil. We see before us a huge community of producers, the members of which are unceasingly striving to deprive each other of the fruits of their collective labor, not by force, but on the whole in faithful compliance with legally established rules. Private capital tends to become concentrated in a few hands, partly because of competition among the capitalists, and partly because technological development and the increasing division of labor encourage the formation of larger units of production at the expense of smaller ones. The result of these developments is an oligarchy of private capital, the enormous power of which cannot be effectively checked even by a democratically organized political society. I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. A planned economy which adjusts production to the needs of the community would distribute the work to be done among all those able to work and would guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. The education of the individual, in addition to promoting his own innate abilities, would attempt to develop in him a sense of responsibility for his fellow men in place of the glorification of power and success in our present society. As the 1950s came and went, so did the outward support for socialism, condemned as a system because of the form of state socialism that gripped the people of Russia and the people of those nations held within the Russian orbit. All but the most debauched communists in the United States no longer looked to Russia for direction. Liberalism rose to take on many of the issues around which socialists had formed an activist vanguard. Those who continued to or came to embrace Henry George's ideals were by this time voices crying out from the wilderness. As Robert Clancy, director of the New York Henry George School of Social Science, wrote in 1955, "For one reason or another, Henry George is pushed out of sight, but he just refuses to stay pushed. Every so often there is a flurry of interest in Henry George, a spate of articles in the press, a mention or two in halls of learning and legislation, but it hasn't yet taken hold. When I behold the marvelous performance of our teaching and propagating on the one hand, and the endless involvements of our deliberations in our councils on the other, I sometimes see ourselves as playing a role not unlike that of the ancient Greeks or the modern French. They were the teachers of mankind, but could not organize a government. They thought too much. Their ideas, however, gave form and direction to others who had the necessary organizing skills. This is not a bad role to play. It is a great role. By the 1960s, what debates were occurring between the followers of Henry George and the followers of Karl Marx likely occurred in one of the many classrooms scattered around the United States, Canada, Australia, Britain, Denmark, the Dominican Republic, and a few other countries that attempted to rebuild the Georgist movement by means of adult education. Some 1,300 people completed courses at the New York School in 1965. Another 300 completed correspondence courses. A speakers bureau filled 55 engagements in the New York region. Roughly 125,000 people were reported to have completed the school's basic course in political economy since the school was established in 1932. By the early 1970s, however, the period of sustained educational outreach was in decline. A major reason was the competition for students by degree-granting community colleges and schools offering specialized training. Fewer people had the time to devote to a year of study in political economy that offered neither academic credits nor credentials important to career advancement. Although the Henry George School survived and survives in New York City, with the closing of many extensions and affiliates, the Georgist movement lost its main means of replacing the old guard as they aged and died off. There are thousands of people today scattered around the globe who are convinced that Henry George's proposed solutions to our most significant economic and social problems are the right solutions. And after decades of ideological bias against any proposals based on the ideas of Karl Marx, there is renewed examination and interest not only in Marx's writings, but in systemic reforms falling into the general definition of socialism. In the United States, the most prominent figure associated with the resurrection of democratic socialism, or social democracy if one prefers, has been Bernie Sanders. Sanders, that I have been able to determine, has never voiced an opinion about Henry George's call for the public capture of the rent of land. That said, as mayor of Burlington, Vermont, Sanders helped to create the nation's largest land trust devoted to the creation of permanent affordable housing. However, one of the strongest voices today in support of democratic socialism, economics professor Richard Wolff, has studied Henry George as well as Karl Marx. Back in 2016, Richard Wolff was guest on the Henry George School of Social Science online interview program Smart Talk. Professor Wolff had recently retired from teaching mainstream, that is neoclassical, economics at the University of Massachusetts and was lecturing at the New School in New York City. He now felt free to express himself without reservation in support of his view that the capitalist system must be supplanted by a system devoted to socialist principles and cooperative enterprise. In this interview, he covered considerable historic ground, explaining why and how capitalism had devolved into a highly exploitative system. The process began in earnest, he observed, after the end of the Second World War, as corporate interests continuously substituted technology for the high number of people employed in the factories, mines, and resource extracting enterprises of the United States and other mature economies. Echoes of Joseph Schumpeter's concept of creative destruction are heard, but from a negative point of view. What happens to those who are replaced by new technologies? What is their prospect for a secure future? Andrew Mazzoni proposed to Professor Wolff that if Henry George's scheme of the public capture of the rent of nature was instituted, the fund thereby raised could be channeled to all workers, even to all members of society, to permit workers to bring financial resources to the establishment of cooperative enterprises. Here is a word-for-word transcript of Professor Wolff's response. I think that I would love to have an alliance between Georges and us. I think your idea of using the ground rent notion, the notion that as societies grow and develop, the accident that they compete for pieces of land that are limited while the population grows, and that, therefore, deliver huge portions of the national wealth to the people who have done absolutely nothing to create the land that they sat on, other than control the rights to exclude others as societies, that would give us the funds. And indeed, there are other ways of collecting the funds to enable there to be a cooperative sector of our economy. It ought to be clear to everyone who has remained with me as this story has been told, there are no final words to be said. History continues to unfold day by day. What the future holds for us and the generations to come will depend on the extent to which reason and common sense prevail. I end with an excerpt from a letter written in 1896 by Henry George to Leo Tolstoy, at a time when he was already experiencing declining health and may have felt he had only a few years left to contribute to the causes of liberty and justice. He wrote, "I am now engaged on a work, the most elaborate I have yet undertaken, a review of the whole science of political economy, which will explain more fully and systematically than I have yet been able to do my view of human life and its relations. Like all such things, this has proved a longer and harder task than I had anticipated. But if it is permitted to me to finish it, I shall send you an early copy. And after that, hope to visit my friends in Europe, and with your permission will try to see you." Had Henry George lived to promote his last book, perhaps this work would have stimulated broad discussion and debate. In death, his life was celebrated, but the momentum for systemic reform was aggressively radicalized, as were the forces determined to preserve the status quo. A review of the science of political economy by Hamlin Garland optimistically looked to a future in which George's insights would one day prevail. His aim is truth, his standard justice. The ranked power of the world could not daunt him when he walked the earth, and all the powers visible and invisible cannot prevail against the spirit of his message of light. As for the potential for change associated with the rebirth of interest in Marxist teaching, Professor Wolff offers this. The demands for concrete alternatives to capitalism and the critiques of classical socialism and communism from the left have coalesced into renewed interest in and new conceptions of cooperative enterprises. Major enterprise decisions are no longer to be monopolized by the major shareholders and the boards of directors those shareholders select. That norm in capitalist corporations is to be abandoned. Instead, workplaces, enterprises are to be democratized. Workers are to become collectively their own board of directors in fully cooperative enterprises. They would decide what, how, and where to produce, and they would distribute the surpluses or profits generated in and by their enterprise. And with that, we've reached the end of the final lecture of this course. If you have comments or questions, I encourage you to place them in the comment section on YouTube, and I will do my best to respond as soon as I have an opportunity. Thanks so much for joining me.